Chapter 1. The Visitor in Mourning. It was in the early spring of 1891, a time when the air in London hung thick with that peculiar dampness which seems to blur the outlines of both man and motive, that I once again found myself residing at Baker Street. My medical practice in Paddington had, through no fault but fortune's, become rather more tranquil than profitable, and Holmes, who was ever indulgent to my restlessness, welcomed my return with that restrained warmth which he reserved for both violins and old companions. The morning in question had dawned grey and windless. The thick curtains at 221B allowed but a dim light to filter through, rendering the sitting-room an island of shadow and quiet speculation. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the sofa, his dressing-gown cinched loosely, a pipe smouldering between long fingers, and an open volume of Horace upon his knee. At his elbow lay a neat row of chemical vials, their contents glinting like captured dawnlight. The faint odor of some pungent reagent mingled with the ever-present tobacco haze. "You are occupied, Holmes?" I asked, setting aside my walking-stick. "Merely diverting the mind, Watson," he replied without glancing up. "Horace, to cleanse the intellect, alkaloids to engage it, and tobacco to keep the equilibrium. Were I deprived of all three, I might risk becoming as sentimental as a poet or as dull as a politician." "You forget," I said, "that your poet and politician may be one and the same." He permitted the faintest curve of amusement to touch his lips. "True, though neither, I think, would find my company agreeable for long." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson's discreet knock interrupted our morning ritual. "A lady to see you, sir," she announced, her voice carrying that subtle tension which foretells a disturbance to domestic peace. "She is most anxious, and says her business is urgent." Holmes stirred at once. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson." Moments later our visitor entered, a tall woman, perhaps 35 years of age, dressed in the full mourning attire of the recently bereaved. Her face was striking rather than beautiful, pale, sharply defined, and possessed of a composure that seemed almost studied. She held herself with an air of dignity, though her gloved hands betrayed a tremor she could not master. "Pray be seated, madam," Holmes said gently, motioning to the armchair by the fire. "You find yourself among friends, I assure you." "I hardly know where to begin," she said, her voice low but clear. "My name is Mrs. Lydia Fairborn, or rather was." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Was?" She gave a nervous laugh. "You will think me mad, Mr. Holmes, but I have reason to believe that my husband, George Fairborn, who was buried in St. James's Cemetery not 3 weeks ago, is still alive." Even Holmes, who had heard the most extraordinary statements uttered with perfect calm, leaned forward slightly at this. "Indeed, madam? You must give us every detail." Her composure faltered then, and she drew a folded letter from her reticule. "It began 3 days ago. I received this through the Morning Post." She passed the envelope across the table. It was addressed in a neat, masculine hand to Mrs. Lydia Fairborn, 6 Belgrave Mews, London. The handwriting, as Holmes noted instantly, matched that of the death certificate he requested later that morning. But that, of course, I learned only after. Holmes unfolded the letter with great care, his eyes scanning it rapidly. It read, "My dearest Lydia, forgive the cruelty of my silence and the deceit that has forced me to such an unholy disguise. I cannot yet explain, but know this: I live, though the world must believe me dead. Trust no one, least of all those who call themselves my friends. When the clock strikes 8 this Friday evening, remain within doors, bolt them, burn this letter. Yours in everlasting affection, George." Holmes read it twice before speaking. "You are certain this is your husband's hand?" "As certain as I am of my own name. The very loops of his G and the flourish of his signature, I could not mistake them." "And your husband's death? You identified the body yourself?" Her voice trembled. "Yes. He was found in the Thames, near Chelsea Bridge. The police said he must have fallen in during one of his late business appointments. He was an accountant, you see, with clients of varied reputation. The face was, forgive me, disfigured, but the clothing and watch were his. The authorities were satisfied. There was no inquest. Holmes steepled his fingers, his expression distant. No inquest. Curious. I interjected. Surely, Holmes, if the police identified him? Precisely. Holmes cut in. If the police identified him, we must always ask. Upon what evidence? Mrs. Fairborn drew from her reticule a small object wrapped in paper. There is something more, she said. 2 nights after receiving the letter, I found this on my windowsill. Holmes unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a gold cufflink, tarnished and scratched, bearing the initials GF. He held it to the light, his keen grey eyes narrowing. And this, too, you recognize. It was one of a pair I gave him on our wedding day. Holmes rose abruptly and paced to the window. Watson, he said quietly, you recall the case of the man who vanished from his own funeral. Holmes, you cannot mean. I mean only that men have been declared dead before they have earned the privilege, he said dryly. And this letter, Watson, is not the work of a ghost. He turned back to Mrs. Fairborn. Madam, your husband's affairs, did they involve any recent irregularities, debts, threats, or secrets you might have overheard? She hesitated. There was one man, she said finally. A Mr. Holbridge, his business partner. He came often to the house. After my husband's death, he arranged everything, the papers, the funeral, the sale of his office. He was most attentive, too attentive. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Holbridge, you have his address? Yes. 9 Wandsworth Terrace. Excellent. Watson, we shall pay this Mr. Holbridge a visit. I suspect he will be most surprised to hear that his late associate is corresponding from beyond the grave. Mrs. Fairborn's gloved hands clenched. Mr. Holmes, you do believe me, then? I believe, madam, Holmes replied gravely, that someone has gone to considerable trouble to convince you of an impossibility. The question is, why? As she rose to leave, Holmes accompanied her to the door with uncharacteristic courtesy. When he returned, he stood in silence, his eyes fixed upon the smouldering cufflink in the lamplight. Well, Holmes? I asked at last. He smiled faintly. A man dies, Watson, and is buried. Yet 3 weeks later he writes to his widow. A trivial contradiction, you might say. But it is contradictions, my dear fellow, that make the world worth investigating. Shall we? He reached for his hat and cane, the gleam of the chase already lighting his features. And so it was that before noon that day, we set forth into the mist-veiled streets of London, unaware that we were embarking upon one of the strangest and most perilous adventures of our long acquaintance. The singular affair of the gentleman buried twice. Chapter 2. The partner at Wandsworth Terrace. The fog lay thick upon the Thames that afternoon, a slow-moving shroud of grey that swallowed whole the outlines of bridges and chimneys, leaving only the faintest lamps to blink like dying stars through its folds. The rattle of our hansom cab echoed hollowly along the slick cobblestones as Holmes and I made our way southward toward Wandsworth Terrace, that melancholy row of houses which overlooked the river's quieter bends. The horses' hooves splashed up the residue of a recent rain, and the air was pungent with that peculiar mixture of soot, damp wool, and decay that belongs to London alone. Holmes sat motionless beside me, his chin sunk upon his breast and his eyes half closed, as was his wont when some new case engaged the full machinery of his mind. I knew better than to interrupt him during such intervals. Experience had taught me that his silence was not apathy but the most concentrated form of thought, a stillness more intense than speech. At length, as the cab drew up before a dark, narrow house marked No. 9, he stirred. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, stepping down lightly. 3 windows shuttered on the upper floor, yet soot freshly disturbed upon the sill of the 3rd from the left. Someone has looked out within the last hour. A curious precaution for a man of business. The door was opened by a maidservant, pale and thin, who eyed us with the nervous suspicion of one accustomed to uneasy households. Holmes presented his card with quiet authority. "Mr. Holbridge, if you please. Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson to see him on a private matter." She hesitated, then vanished down the dim hallway. Presently a voice called, deep, well measured, yet betraying a faint tremor, "Show them in." The room into which we were ushered was that of a prosperous clerk rather than a man of ambition. Ledgers lined the shelves, a safe stood against the wall, and the air was thick with the odor of stale tobacco and ink. Behind a heavy desk sat Mr. Edwin Holbridge, a man of some 40 years, clean-shaven, his hair already receding, and his expression marked by that particular pallor which comes either from overwork or from a troubled conscience. Holmes inclined his head courteously. "Mr. Holbridge, I believe. You were associated with the late Mr. George Fairborn." Holbridge's eyes darted from Holmes to me and back again. "Associated?" "Yes. Yes, indeed. Fairborn was my partner. A tragic affair, his death, shocking to all who knew him." Holmes's tone was conversational, almost indifferent. "You were close, then?" "Close?" The man gave a short, dry laugh. "We worked together nearly 10 years. I dare say no one knew him better than I." "Then perhaps you will enlighten me," Holmes said, seating himself without invitation. "Under what circumstances did your partnership conclude?" "By death, Mr. Holmes," Holbridge said coldly. "Surely you know as much. Poor George fell into the Thames returning from a client meeting. There was nothing mysterious about it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah. And yet his widow has since received a letter, in her husband's hand, declaring that he still lives." The effect of this statement was remarkable. The blood drained from Holbridge's face as if Holmes had struck him. He half rose, gripping the edge of the desk. "That is impossible," he gasped. "Preposterous! Who would dare?" "That," said Holmes softly, "is precisely what I have come to determine." There was a silence. Then, recovering himself with an effort, Holbridge sank back into his chair. "You must forgive my reaction, gentlemen. Mrs. Fairborn is a delicate woman. This letter, whoever sent it, must be attempting some cruel fraud. Perhaps an extortion scheme." "Possibly," Holmes replied. "Yet your tone, Mr. Holbridge, suggests that you find the idea more frightening than offensive." Holbridge's lips tightened. "I have no patience for insinuation, sir." "None is intended. I merely observe that your hand trembles when you deny the impossible." Holmes rose and began to stroll idly about the room, his eyes glancing over ledgers, maps, and papers with the swift precision of a hawk in flight. "Your books appear in excellent order. I trust your late partner's affairs were likewise settled." "Entirely so," Holbridge said stiffly. "I handled the dissolution myself. Mrs. Fairborn had no head for business." "Quite so. And his clients, were they of the usual sort?" The man hesitated, then shrugged. "A few tradesmen, some investors. Fairborn occasionally undertook private bookkeeping for gentlemen of means." "Gentlemen?" Holmes repeated quietly. "Would you by any chance include among them one named Venner?" At this the man's eyes widened. It was the smallest of reactions, but to Holmes it was a confession. I may have heard the name," Holbridge stammered. "A shipping agent, I think." "Why?" Holmes's tone was almost playful. "Because, my dear sir, there are few coincidences in London society, and fewer still in death. George Fairborn's body was found not half a mile from the wharf owned by a certain Mr. James Venner, a gentleman, I might add, who departed suddenly for the Continent 2 days after the funeral." Holbridge's composure collapsed entirely. He rose and began pacing the carpet in visible agitation. "If you knew what I know," he burst out, "you would understand why I wish the dead to remain buried." Holmes's voice cut across his panic like steel. "Then perhaps you will enlighten us." But Holbridge shook his head. "I cannot, I dare not. There are forces here, Mr. Holmes, that you would do well not to meddle with. Fairborn brought this upon himself. Let sleeping devils lie." Holmes regarded him for a moment with that peculiar mixture of pity and contempt, which he reserved for men who hovered between villainy and fear. Then he turned toward the door. "Very well, Mr. Holbridge. You will forgive me if I prefer my devils awake. Good afternoon. We had almost reached the hallway when Holbridge's voice halted us. "Wait! One thing more." We turned. His face had altered. It was the face of a man who has already seen the hangman's noose in his dreams. "If Mrs. Fairborn has any sense," he said hoarsely, "tell her to burn that letter, and leave London at once." The fog outside seemed thicker as we stepped into the street. Holmes stood for a moment, his gaze fixed upon the river's dim gleam beyond the houses. "Watson," he said, "did you mark his hesitation at the name Venner?" "I did, though I fail to see what significance it carries." "Nor do I." "Yet," Holmes murmured, "but one does not invoke devils without good reason. There is something rotten in this partnership, my dear fellow, and it will not rest beneath the earth forever." We hailed another cab, and as we rattled away through the dripping streets, Holmes fell into one of his long silences. It was near dusk when at last he spoke again. "There are two possibilities, Watson," he said quietly. "Either George Fairborn is dead, and some unscrupulous hand has sought to trade upon his memory, or he lives, and another man was buried in his stead. In either case, we are dealing with a deception most deliberate and a motive most grave." "Then you believe the letter genuine?" "I believe," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing, "that its writer knew more of George Fairborn's habits, penmanship and secrets than any mere stranger could, which limits our suspects considerably." "And what do you propose next?" He smiled faintly. "To visit a graveyard, my dear Watson. There are times when the quickest route to the truth lies 6 feet below." Thus ended our second day upon the strange affair of the gentleman buried twice. I recall vividly the chill that crept upon me as Holmes uttered those words, for though I had followed him through crimes both grotesque and perilous, there was in his tone that evening something I had seldom heard before, a shadow of fascination, almost admiration, for the cunning mind that had set this grim puzzle in motion. Chapter 3. The Grave at St. James's. We set out the following morning beneath a sky that threatened rain, the clouds hanging low and heavy over the city. A damp wind swept through Baker Street, stirring the soot from the chimneys and rattling the loose shutters of the neighboring houses. Holmes, already dressed for the expedition, moved about the room with a nervous precision that betrayed his suppressed excitement. His long fingers, stained faintly from chemical work, drummed lightly upon his walking stick as he waited for me to finish my coffee. "You have your revolver, Watson?" he asked without turning. "Indeed," I replied, somewhat surprised. "You expect danger, then?" "Danger, perhaps not. But when one sets out to disturb a grave, one never knows what other secrets may be unearthed." He gave a thin smile and slipped his magnifying lens into his pocket. "A grave," he continued, "is a most eloquent witness, if one has the courtesy to listen." It was close to 11 o'clock when we reached St. James's Cemetery, a quiet and somewhat neglected ground on the southern edge of Chelsea. The wrought iron gates groaned upon their hinges, and beyond them the narrow paths wound between leaning tombstones and tangled ivy. The place had an air of mournful abandonment, the sort of spot where the living seldom tarry, and the dead seem reluctant to rest. Holmes greeted the caretaker, a stooped old fellow named Briggs, with his usual brisk civility. Producing his card, he explained that he acted on behalf of Mrs. Fairborn, and wished to confirm certain details concerning her husband's interment. Briggs, who appeared accustomed to eccentric requests from London gentlemen, led us at once to a low stone near the rear boundary. "There you are, sir," he said, pointing with a trembling hand. "Mr. George Fairborn, buried the 21st of March. Quiet funeral, that one. Only the widow and one other gent present." Holmes looked up sharply. "One other gentleman, you say? Would his name by chance have been Hulbridge?" Briggs nodded. "Aye, that's the one. Stood right where you are, sir. Never said much. Just watched the coffin go down." Holmes knelt, examining the ground with that feline grace peculiar to him. The grave was simple, a modest stone slab bearing the inscription, George Fairborn, beloved husband, 1856-1891. The earth above it appeared firm and undisturbed, yet Holmes's quick eye missed nothing. He produced a small tape measure and took several careful readings from the headstone to the bordering path, muttering numbers beneath his breath. Then, stooping lower, he ran a gloved hand lightly along the soil. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Watson, observe. This surface bears traces of having been leveled within the past week." I crouched beside him. "Surely that must be due to settling after rain." He shook his head. "No, my dear fellow. Note the absence of moss here. And here. The topmost inch of earth has been disturbed quite recently. I can even see the faint outline where a spade pressed down." His eyes glittered. "Someone has paid Mr. Fairborn a nocturnal visit." "Good heavens, Holmes! For what purpose?" "That," he said, rising, "is the question which will bring us closer to our resurrected gentleman." He turned to Briggs. "Tell me, my good man, have you seen any strangers here at night? Any unusual movement among the graves?" The old caretaker frowned. "Now that you mention it, sir, there was something queer. Last Tuesday, I was locking up when I spied a light yonder between the trees, just a lantern swaying about. Thought it might be them boys from the village again, so I shouted. Light went out at once, and when I got there, nothing. Not a soul." Holmes nodded. "Tuesday, the very day after Mrs. Fairborn received her letter. The plot thickens, Watson." He offered Briggs a half-sovereign and instructed him to speak to no one of our visit. Then, in his brisk way, he turned toward the gate. "Come, Watson. We have seen enough daylight for one morning. The truth we seek, I suspect, will show itself only after dark." That evening at 9:30 we returned to St. James's. The rain had come and gone, leaving behind a fine mist that drifted like ghostly smoke among the tombstones. Holmes carried a dark lantern beneath his cloak, and a small black case containing several instruments whose purpose I could only guess. We moved in silence, our boots muffled by the damp grass, until we reached the grave of George Fairborn. Holmes knelt at once and set to work with the precision of a surgeon. From his case he produced a thin metal probe and pressed it gently into the soil at measured intervals. Presently the point struck something firm. Holmes's face grew taut with concentration. "Wood," he whispered. "Not more than 2 feet down." He withdrew the probe and examined its tip by the light of his lantern. A trace of moisture gleamed upon it, but it was not the earthy damp one might expect. He touched it, then smelled his finger. "Oil," he murmured. "Machine oil, Watson. What business has that upon a coffin?" Before I could answer, a sound reached us, the crunch of gravel somewhere behind. Holmes extinguished the light with a quick movement. We crouched low, listening. A minute later, a dim shape emerged between the headstones. A man in a long coat, carrying a lantern of his own. He paused not 10 yards from us, glancing about with the cautious air of one who dreads discovery. Then, to my astonishment, he made directly for the grave of George Fairborn. Holmes's hand touched my arm. "Not a word," he breathed. The man knelt, placed the lantern beside him, and began to dig swiftly but quietly, his spade slicing through the wet earth. The light fell across his face for an instant, narrow, angular, with deep-set eyes and a bristling moustache. Holmes's lips moved silently. Halbridge. The name burned in my mind. We watched, scarcely daring to breathe, as the man uncovered a small wooden box no larger than a valise. He wiped the soil from its lid, lifted it free, and placed it upon the grass. Then he rose, looked about once more, and began to retreat. In that moment Holmes sprang to his feet. "Hold there, Mr. Halbridge," he cried, his voice ringing through the night. The man gave a hoarse cry and bolted. Holmes was after him in an instant, his long coat streaming behind him. I followed as best I could, my revolver drawn, but the uneven ground and fog confounded my pursuit. Twice I stumbled over a sunken stone. By the time I regained my footing, the figures had vanished among the graves. I caught up with Holmes near the outer wall. He stood alone, breathing hard, one hand gripping the iron gate. "Gone," he said curtly. He knows the ground better than I do, and he had the advantage of guilt to spur him. And the box? I asked. He lifted the dark lantern. Safe. I intercepted it before he could reclaim it. We returned to the Fairborn grave and set the box upon a nearby stone. Holmes examined it carefully before opening. It was of plain construction, bound with tarnished brass and secured by a simple clasp. Inside lay a quantity of papers, neatly tied, and, more curious still, a folded garment of fine black cloth. Holmes spread the garment open. It was a mourning coat. "Watson," he said softly, "I believe we have found what Mr. Hallbridge feared most." He drew out the topmost paper, holding it to the light. It was a ledger page, columns of figures, names, and dates, but what caught my eye was a single entry, written in a hurried hand. "Transfer to J. Venner, £3,000, March 18th. Holmes gave a low whistle. 3 days before the death, and addressed to the very man whose name so disturbed our friend. The trail grows clearer." He turned to me, eyes bright with that electric gleam I knew so well. "Watson, we are dealing not with a resurrection, but with a transaction, one that demanded a corpse for its completion." "Then you think Fairborn's death was contrived?" "Contrived or substituted?" Holmes replied grimly. "Either way, one man profited, and another was buried to secure it." He closed the box, securing it once more. "Come, Watson. This cemetery has served its purpose. The living will tell us more than the dead. Tomorrow we shall pay a visit to Mr. James Venner, and I fancy his conscience will not rest half so quietly as poor Fairborn's." Thus ended that strange night among the graves. As we made our way back toward the flickering lights of Chelsea, I could not shake the image of that disturbed earth and the silent tombstones surrounding us. There are moments even now when I recall the chill of that mist upon my cheek, and the glimmer in Holmes's eyes as he whispered, "A man may deceive his friends, Watson, even his wife, but the grave, the grave tells no lies." Chapter 4. The Shipping Agent of Blackfriars. It was on the morning after our nocturnal adventure in St. James's Cemetery that I awoke to find Holmes already deep in the pursuit of knowledge. The breakfast things lay untouched upon the table, and my friend, arrayed in his dressing gown, stood before the mantel with a sheaf of documents spread like a hand of cards. His keen ascetic features were illuminated by a shaft of wintry light that broke through the fog outside, and the faint aroma of strong coffee mingled with the acrid scent of his tobacco. "Ah, Watson," he said without turning, "you rise at an opportune moment. We have, I believe, a corpse that refuses to remain silent, a business partner who digs up the dead, and a shipping agent whose name appears where only a clergyman's should." I drew nearer, still half in the fog of sleep. "Venner," I said. "The name from the ledger." "Precisely. James Venner, late of the firm Venner and Blayton, maritime brokers, Blackfriars. A discreet inquiry through my friend at the yard informs me that our gentleman departed for the continent 2 days after Fairborn's funeral, ostensibly on business in Antwerp. But his luggage, interestingly enough, was never checked aboard any vessel leaving the London docks." "Then he never left?" Holmes smiled. "It would seem our Mr. Venner prefers his voyages metaphorical. He is at this very moment residing at the Royal Strand Hotel under the less exotic title of Mr. James Verner. A spelling variation too subtle for the police, but not for me. A man who changes but one letter of his name wishes to hide only from those who know it too well." He took up his hat and cane with that brisk decisiveness which always heralded the beginning of action. "Come, Watson. Let us pay our respects to our errant shipper. A small conversation may yet bring this phantom husband to light." The fog along the embankment had thickened by the time we reached the Strand. The Royal Strand Hotel was one of those respectable establishments much frequented by visiting merchants, comfortable without luxury, discreet without austerity. A pair of hansom cabs waited before the steps, their drivers gossiping idly in the mist. Holmes's manner as we entered was that of an amiable but slightly fussy gentleman seeking accommodation. He engaged the clerk in harmless conversation regarding available rooms, while his eyes, those keen darting grey eyes, scanned the register with the quickness of a striking hawk. He tapped the open page with his forefinger. "Ah, yes. Mr. James Werner, Antwerp. Is he still within?" The clerk, a polite young man, consulted a keyboard behind him. "Indeed, sir. Number 12, first floor, though he seldom takes callers." Holmes smiled disarmingly. "All the better. Dr. Watson and I have no wish to disturb his leisure. We are old acquaintances from the docks, merely passing through." The man hesitated only a moment before handing over the direction. In another minute we were climbing the carpeted stairs and standing before the door of number 12. Holmes knocked softly, once, then twice. A shuffling sound was heard within, followed by a voice wary and sharp. "Who's there?" "An old associate, Mr. Werner," said Holmes in a calm tone. "One who comes on a matter of mutual advantage." There was silence. Then the sound of a bolt withdrawn. The door opened an inch. A man's face appeared, narrow, tanned, and deeply lined with eyes of a restless, watchful sort. Holmes inclined his head politely. "Mr. Werner. Or shall I say Werner?" The man's hand tightened upon the doorframe. "Who are you, sir, and what do you want?" Holmes stepped past him with the easy authority that few men resisted. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We have come, Mr. Werner, to speak of George Fairborn." At that name the man started visibly. "Fairborn?" he repeated, his voice thick. "He's dead. Drowned 3 weeks ago. So the newspapers assure us," said Holmes lightly. "Yet most inconveniently he appears to be writing letters to his widow." Werner's face darkened. He shut the door and gestured sharply toward the window. "Keep your voice down. You don't know what you're meddling in." "I am attempting to remedy precisely that ignorance," Holmes returned, seating himself uninvited. "Perhaps you will enlighten me." Werner remained standing, arms folded. "There's nothing to tell. Fairborn handled my accounts. He got himself into difficulties, speculations, forged ledgers, the sort of thing that ruins honest men. He fell into the river one night, and that's the end of it." Holmes smiled. "And yet, curiously, the only transaction of record before his accident was a transfer of £3,000 from your account to his, a sum which has since vanished." Werner's eyes flickered. "That money was for business expenses. I can prove it." "I'm sure you can," said Holmes quietly. "Perhaps with the same skill with which you can bury a man and keep his ghost well fed in Antwerp." Werner turned upon him fiercely. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean," Holmes said, rising to his full height, "that you are sheltering a man the world believes dead. Where is George Fairborn?" The shipping agent's bravado faltered. His hands trembled, and for a long moment he stared at Holmes with something like despair. Then, with an effort, he mastered himself. "You'll get nothing from me," he said hoarsely. "Nothing. Leave London, Mr. Holmes, if you value your skin. There are men behind this business who would think no more of your life than of an ink blot." Holmes's expression did not alter. "Men who dig up graves by lantern light?" Werner flinched as if struck. "You've been to the cemetery." Holmes regarded him coldly. "I seldom discuss my whereabouts with strangers, but yes, and I have in my possession a box that once lay buried there, a box containing your ledger entries." For a moment I thought the man would spring at him. Then his shoulders sagged. "You don't understand," he muttered. "It's gone too far now. Fairborn isn't the man you think. The sentence was cut short by a sharp knock at the door. Werner froze. Holmes's eyes darted to the handle. "Expecting company?" he whispered. "No." Werner breathed. "Good God, they've found me." Holmes motioned me to the side of the door, revolver ready. The knock came again, more insistent. Then a voice, low, smooth, and unmistakably authoritative. "Mr. Werner, I believe you have something belonging to us." Without warning, Werner snatched open the window and swung one leg over the sill. "They'll kill me if I stay." he gasped. "Tell Mrs. Fairborn." The rest was lost in a crash of breaking glass as he dropped to the street below. Holmes flung open the sash, but it was too late. The fog swallowed him instantly. From the pavement came the clatter of running feet, then silence. We turned back just as the door burst inward. 2 men entered, broad-shouldered, heavy-featured fellows in rough seamen's coats. One brandished a revolver, the other a knife. Holmes was quicker. With a movement as swift as it was unexpected, he hurled the lamp from the mantel straight into their faces. It shattered, plunging the room into darkness and confusion. I heard the crack of my own revolver, the grunt of a man struck, and the crash of overturned furniture. Then a sudden gust of air. Holmes had thrown the window wide. "Out, Watson!" he called. "This way!" We scrambled through the opening and dropped into the narrow alley below. The fog wrapped around us like a curtain. Behind, voices shouted and footsteps thundered, but Holmes seized my arm and drew me into a side passage so narrow I could scarcely turn. We emerged breathless into a deserted courtyard behind the hotel. Holmes straightened his coat, his face calm once more. "An instructive interview, Watson. We have learned that Venner fears for his life, that others fear what he might say, and that our Mr. Fairborn moves in a circle larger than domestic tragedy." "Do you think those men were sent by Halbridge?" Holmes shook his head. "No. Halbridge is a pawn. The power behind this affair lies elsewhere. These men were sailors. See the hemp fibers on the sleeve I tore. Dockhands, perhaps, but working under orders. We are no longer dealing with mere fraud, my dear fellow, but with a conspiracy that reeks of the river." He glanced up the foggy street. "Venner will surface again. Desperate men always do. But when he does, we must be there to receive him." That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes spread before him the box from the grave once more. The papers rustled softly in the firelight. "Observe, Watson," he said, holding up a crumpled page. "An account of cargo. Acis Halcyon, bound for Antwerp, departed March 19th. £3,000 declared in goods. Yet the vessel never arrived, nor was it reported lost. Then where is it?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "That, Watson, is the heart of the matter. A missing ship, a false death, and a partnership built upon deceit. I fancy our gentleman, buried twice, will soon rise again, and when he does, the tide of the Thames itself may tell us his story." He leaned back, his profile sharp against the firelight, and I saw in his expression that singular mixture of triumph and tension that marked the approach of revelation. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we go to the docks." Chapter 5. Voices on the Thames. That same evening the wind came moaning over London like the sigh of some enormous beast, low, continuous, and filled with menace. The lamps along Baker Street trembled in their sockets, and the fog, that eternal spectre of our city, rolled thick and yellow through the night. Holmes had spent the better part of the day poring over the papers from the grave box, classifying, cross-referencing, and muttering to himself with an absorption that bordered on the fanatical. By the time I returned from the hospital, I found him already equipped for an expedition, his heavy ulster coat buttoned to the throat, his revolver loaded, and his lantern freshly trimmed. "You come in good hour, Watson," he said briskly, throwing me my own coat. "I have made certain inquiries among the river police. The SS Halcyon was not reported lost, because it was never listed to sail at all." I stared. "Then the records were forged?" "More cleverly than that," said Holmes. "The name was borrowed. The Halcyon exists, a small trading vessel that departed Hamburg 3 months ago. But a second Halcyon was registered at Blackfriars under false credentials. Its purpose, I suspect, was to smuggle something, or someone, out of England unseen." "You think Fairborn was aboard?" "I think, my dear fellow, that the Thames keeps better secrets than the graveyard. Come, we go to the docks." The journey was a grim one. Our hansom rattled through near-deserted streets until the familiar scent of tar, rope, and wet timber announced our arrival at the river. The docks lay half in shadow, half in the sickly glow of gaslights blurred by mist. A line of barges drifted like ghosts upon the sluggish tide. Somewhere, A bell tolled 3. Holmes paid the driver, and we descended toward the water. "Keep close, Watson," he murmured. "The folk of this quarter are not fond of questions, nor of daylight." We passed through narrow lanes where dim figures moved, carrying crates and whispering in the gloom. The names of foreign ports gleamed faintly from the sides of moored vessels: Antwerp, Calais, Le Havre. And the sluggish wash of the river was broken now and again by the creak of rope and the hollow thud of a shifting hull. At length we came to a stretch of wharf half in ruins, with rotting planks and a sign that read, in flaking paint, "Blayton and Venner, shipping agents." Holmes halted. "Our friend's old domain," he said softly. "Let us see what ghosts remain to haunt it." He crouched beside a locked door and produced from his pocket a small coil of wire and a thin metal rod. Within half a minute the lock yielded with a faint click, a sound lost in the murmur of the tide. We entered. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the odor of damp rope and decayed wood. Piles of ledgers and broken crates lay scattered about, and in one corner stood a heavy desk, its drawers rifled. Holmes's lantern cast a yellow circle upon the floor, revealing muddy footprints, fresh by their wet gleam. "Someone has been here within the hour," I whispered. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, kneeling to examine them. "2 sets of prints, one heavy, the other light. The heavier belongs to a sailor. Note the hobnails. The lighter, sir, observe the narrow instep, a man of refinement. Our quarry has recently paid a visit." At that moment a faint sound reached us, the soft scrape of a boot outside the wall, followed by a murmur of voices. Holmes motioned for silence. We extinguished the lantern and moved to the window. Through the cracked glass I could just discern 2 figures standing on the wharf below, one tall and thin, the other stocky and broad-shouldered. The taller man was speaking in a low, rapid tone. "I tell you it's madness," he said. "He'll never keep silent now. You should have finished him when you had the chance." "Orders are orders," growled the other. "The captain says wait." "Then the captain will hang us all. Venner's gone to ground, the box is missing, and that fool of a woman's begun asking questions." "Quiet, you idiot." The larger man turned his head sharply, and for an instant the light from the river caught his face. It was coarse, brutal, and unmistakably scarred across the left cheek, the mark of an old knife wound. Holmes's hand closed on my sleeve. "Remember that face, Watson. I've seen it in the yard's records. Amos Bragg, river thief and smuggler. The other, by his voice, must be our elusive captain." The taller man moved closer to the edge of the wharf. "If Fairborn talks." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Fairborn. The name hung in the mist like an echo. Before we could hear more, the sound of footsteps approached from the quay. A third figure appeared, cloaked with the collar turned up. The others stiffened. "Captain," said Bragg, "we thought you'd gone to the barge." The newcomer spoke softly, but his voice carried a curious authority. "Change of plans. The tide turns in 20 minutes. We sail at dawn." "What about the dead man?" The captain gave a short, mirthless laugh. "He's not so dead as he was. Bring him aboard." Holmes gripped my arm so tightly I almost cried out. The meaning was unmistakable. Somewhere nearby George Fairborn lived, and was about to be taken down river. The 3 men began to move off along the wharf. Holmes waited until they had disappeared into the fog, then whispered, "Come, Watson. We shall follow." For half an hour we crept after them, keeping to the shadows. The path led us past a row of derelict warehouses to a small inlet where a barge lay moored, a grim, low craft with no name on her stern. 2 lanterns burned faintly near the gangway. Holmes signaled for silence. We crouched behind a pile of timber as the men lifted something from a cart, a shape long and motionless, wrapped in coarse canvas. They carried it aboard. A chill ran down my spine. "Good heavens, Holmes," I whispered. "A body." "Alive or dead remains to be seen," he murmured. "But we shall not learn which from here. Observe the tide. They'll cast off within minutes. He drew a small whistle from his pocket, one of those used by the river police, and looked at me grimly. "If they reach open water, we lose them. Stay here. If I signal twice, summon the constables from the watch-post by the bridge." "But Holmes—" "Quickly, Watson, there's no time!" Before I could stop him, he had vanished into the fog, moving silently along the planks toward the moored barge. I caught a brief glimpse of his figure as he climbed aboard. Then he was gone. The minutes that followed were among the most dreadful of my life. The mist thickened until I could scarcely see my own hands. Somewhere ahead ropes creaked, voices muttered, and I heard the dull splash of water against hull. Then a sudden shout, a struggle, and the report of a pistol. "Holmes!" I cried, and forgetting his orders, dashed forward. A man staggered past me out of the mist, clutching his shoulder. I fired once in warning, and he dropped his weapon, vanishing into the fog. The barge was already drifting from the quay. I leapt onto the gunwale and stumbled into the hold. Holmes stood above two fallen figures, his revolver smoking, his face pale but composed. At his feet lay Bragg, unconscious, and beside him, dear heaven, the canvas-wrapped shape now unrolled to reveal the ashen face of George Fairborn himself. "He's alive," Holmes said quickly, kneeling to cut the ropes that bound the man's wrists. "Drugged, but alive." The captain escaped into the fog. I bent over the prostrate figure. The faint rise and fall of his chest confirmed it. "Holmes," I whispered. "Then he truly—" "Yes, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "The man who was buried is not dead, but the man who arranged his resurrection is about to learn that some graves are best left closed. We brought Fairborn to the river police station before dawn. As the first pale light crept over the Thames, he stirred and opened his eyes. Recognition flickered there, confusion, fear, and a strange, haunted shame. Holmes leaned close. "Mr. Fairborn, you have been given a second life. Use it wisely, for there are still men who would see you dead before you speak." The man's lips moved. "Venner, the captain, they promised. No one would ever know." Holmes's gaze hardened. "And yet here we are." He rose, and I saw in his eyes that curious gleam that heralded the next move of the game. "Watson, my dear fellow, the body lives, but the soul of this mystery lies still buried. We must dig again." Chapter 5. The Papers of the Dead, told by Dr. John H. Watson. We waited until the echo of their retreating footsteps had melted into the night before Holmes moved. With a soft click, he produced a set of slender tools from his pocket, instruments I had seen him employ on many a delicate occasion. "Watson," he murmured, "you may call it burglary if you wish, but I call it the pursuit of truth." I said nothing. By long experience I had learned the futility of moral protest where my friend's sense of justice was concerned. Within a minute, the lock of room 23 yielded to his delicate manipulation, and we stepped into the chamber that Miss Lascelles and her companion had so recently quitted. The air within was heavy with the scent of exotic perfume, and still quivered faintly with the disturbance of their departure. The room itself bore the stamp of temporary occupation, an open valise upon the bed, a fan, a travelling cloak, and a half-emptied glass of wine upon the table. Holmes closed the door softly behind us and drew the curtains tight. Then he began his methodical search, that silent, sure-footed dance I had seen so often, in which his keen eyes and long fingers seemed to operate as one. "Observe, Watson," he said, lifting the wine-glass to the light. "2 glasses. One recently touched, one dry. The lady has been here since their departure, the man less often. And note, lipstick, scarlet, not crimson. A woman who alters her colors when she changes her name." He moved to the writing desk and examined a heap of torn papers in the grate. "Burnt fragments. Let us see what the flames failed to devour." With his tweezers he drew forth several charred scraps, which he arranged upon the blotting pad. A faint line of writing could still be discerned. He studied it closely through his lens, murmuring to himself as he pieced the puzzle together. Feather Society. Oath. Penalty by blood. Ha! So my suspicions were not unfounded. A secret order, Watson, and a ruthless one, if this line may be trusted. I bent over his shoulder, but before I could speak he gave a soft exclamation and turned his attention to the underside of the writing desk. Aha! Hollow sound. The most innocent drawer often hides the most guilty secrets. In another instant he had pried open a false panel. From within he drew a small packet bound in twine, wrapped in faded parchment. Upon its outer cover were the words, written in an elegant but trembling hand, "For the eyes of the faithful only. The Crimson Feather." Holmes laid it upon the table and regarded it with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. "We hold the heart of the matter in our hands, Watson, yet a serpent may still lie coiled within." With a swift motion he undid the twine. Inside were several sheets of foreign-made paper, closely written in a firm masculine hand. As Holmes read, his brows drew together in that peculiar furrow which meant his brain was moving with lightning speed. "Good heavens," he murmured. "This is no ordinary conspiracy. These papers link Sir Reginald Brooks to a clandestine trade, a network of men using their legal and political offices to smuggle Indian relics and precious stones under the guise of cultural exchange. The Crimson Feather is not a society of mystics, but a cabal of thieves masquerading as scholars." I started in amazement. "Then Sir Reginald was one of them." Holmes shook his head. "He was their unwilling treasurer, and when he discovered the scale of their corruption, he threatened exposure. That, Watson, sealed his fate." He turned another page, his eyes narrowing. "And here, the final evidence, a letter addressed to Miss Violet Lascelles from one S.B., evidently Signor Bellini. Listen." He read aloud in that low, even tone which I had come to associate with the unmasking of villains. "The fool grows restless. Destroy the ledgers before he can act. The feather must remain unseen. If he speaks, the penalty follows, as sworn." "Watson," Holmes said grimly, folding the paper. "Sir Reginald never had a chance. The order decreed his death, and Our Lady with the crimson plume was the instrument. But there is something more here, something unfinished." He turned the packet over again and examined the parchment closely. Then, with a flick of his nail, he peeled back a second layer of paper, revealing a small envelope sealed in red wax and stamped with the image of a feather. Holmes broke the seal. Inside was a single folded note and a miniature photograph. The note read, "To whomsoever finds this. The Crimson Feather's reach extends beyond England. Beware the mark. It binds by oath and blood. R.B." Holmes gazed at the photograph for a long moment. It showed a man of middle age with sharp features and the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. Across the bottom, in faded ink, was written, "Captain Lionel Trelawney." I gave a cry of astonishment. "Then the murdered man's brother." "Not merely his brother, Watson," said Holmes quietly. "His partner, and perhaps his betrayer." Before I could speak again, a sudden noise from the corridor froze us both. The creak of a footstep, soft but unmistakable. Holmes motioned for silence, extinguished the lamp, and drew me behind the curtain. The door opened slowly. A figure slipped into the darkened room, tall, cloaked, unmistakably feminine. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, I saw the faint glimmer of a crimson feather at her throat. She moved to the desk and began searching feverishly, her gloved hands trembling as she rifled through the drawers. Then she stopped abruptly, her breath catching. "The papers!" she whispered. "Gone!" Holmes stepped forward into the faint light. "You need not trouble yourself, Miss Lascelles. The papers are quite safe, for the moment." With a gasp, she turned, pressing her back against the wall. Her veil had slipped, revealing a face both striking and haunted, olive-skinned, with dark, wide eyes that burned with defiance and fear. "Who are you?" she demanded. "How dare you?" "You know very well who I am," said Holmes calmly. "Sherlock Holmes. And I dare because the man you helped murder dared first. Dared to be honest." Her lips quivered. "You do not understand. I tried to stop them. Bellini, the others. But it was too late. They made me swear the oath. They would have killed me too. Holmes's gaze softened for a brief instant. Then help me now, Miss Lascelles. Tell me where Bellini hides, and perhaps justice will be tempered with mercy. For a long moment she stood motionless, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Then she whispered, "He sails tonight, from Tilbury Docks, aboard the Orion. He carries the rest of the feathers, and the list of names." "Good," said Holmes quietly. "That is all I needed to know." He turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "Holmes, you will not let them hang me." Holmes paused at the door, his face unreadable. "That depends, madam, on how truly you repent. Redemption is sometimes found in a witness box." He motioned to me, and we left her standing there, pale, trembling, and utterly defeated. Outside, the night air struck cold against my face, but Holmes's eyes shone with fierce light. "To Tilbury, Watson. The tide waits for no man, and neither shall we. The Orion carries the key to the whole conspiracy, and perhaps the murderer himself." He raised his hand to hail a cab, and as we sped into the London fog, I could not help but feel that the night ahead would be one neither of us would soon forget. Chapter 6. The Man Who Died Twice. It was late afternoon when George Fairborn, pale and trembling, sat before our hearth at Baker Street. The warmth of the fire painted a feeble glow across his gaunt features, and though Mrs. Hudson had insisted on tea and broth, the man could scarcely lift his cup. His hair was streaked with grey, though he could not have been more than 40, and his eyes, sunken and haunted, flicked restlessly from Holmes to the window, as though expecting some unseen pursuer. Holmes, cross-legged upon his chair, regarded him with that singular expression of detached compassion which he reserved for the rescued but guilty. Between his long fingers he held a thin cigar, which he turned idly as he spoke. "My dear Mr. Fairborn," said he at length, "you have survived both drowning and burial. I should think the latter an experience to alter one's perspective on truth. Let us have it then, entire and unembellished." Fairborn shuddered and clasped his shaking hands. "You cannot imagine, Mr. Holmes, the terror, the deceit. I was trapped from the first moment. They would have killed me had I refused." "Refused what?" I asked gently. He turned to me, and I could see the sweat glistening upon his brow. "To die, Dr. Watson." Holmes's brows arched slightly. "A rare offer to decline. Continue." Fairborn drew a long breath, as though forcing himself to confront the spectres of memory. "It began 6 months ago. I was deeply in debt, more than my share of the firm could bear. Venner approached me with what he called an opportunity. A client, unnamed, desired to vanish from England, leaving no trace, no creditors, no inquiry. For a handsome sum, I was to provide a false identity and certain accounts under my firm's name to facilitate the transfer." Holmes nodded slowly. "And in return you were promised both payment and secrecy." "Exactly. But when I learned that the client was no bankrupt merchant, but a man wanted for treasonable correspondence, smuggling documents abroad, it was too late. Hallbridge knew everything. He and Venner had conspired from the start." "You tried to withdraw?" Holmes prompted. "I did. And that sealed my fate. Venner visited me that evening. He told me with a smile that I would never again trouble my conscience, for I would soon be dead. 2 days later a messenger brought word of a meeting at the wharf. I went, foolishly hoping to bargain. Instead I was seized, drugged, and when I awoke, it was in a coffin, aboard a barge bound downriver." He buried his face in his hands. "They meant to smuggle me abroad as a corpse, to some foreign port where I would live under another name, doing their bidding forever. But something went wrong. The police found the body they meant to substitute for mine, and Venner ordered that I be truly buried to silence me. Only Bragg's greed spared me. He kept me hidden, intending ransom." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Then the letter to your wife?" Fairborn looked up in anguish. "I wrote it, yes, under their instruction. They wished to keep her docile until the money from my accounts was withdrawn." Holmes rose and paced before the fire. his face grave. "You realize, Mr. Fairborn, that your confession implicates yourself in a conspiracy of considerable scale. Forgery, smuggling, and perhaps even murder." "I know," Fairborn whispered. "But I would rather face prison than the terror of those men again." Holmes halted before him. "And where is Venner now?" Fairborn hesitated, then said slowly, "He had a warehouse near Tilbury, an abandoned customs depot by the eastern docks. He spoke often of a final voyage. The last shipment, he called it. That was before he vanished." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Tilbury, the logical point of departure for the continent. Watson, we may yet catch our phantom captain before he fades into the Channel mist." Fairborn shivered violently. "If you go there, you will not return alive." Holmes smiled thinly. "Then we shall go armed, with both revolver and reason." That night Holmes was in his element. The melancholy of the day's revelations had transformed into a cold, crystalline excitement. He moved about our rooms with restless precision, consulting charts of the river, marking routes, examining tide tables, and muttering to himself as he packed his revolver, lantern, and notebook. "At times, Holmes," I ventured, "your enthusiasm for danger is positively inhuman." He glanced up, eyes glittering with that strange inner fire. "Danger, my dear Watson, is merely the clarifier of truth. Men reveal themselves most clearly when they believe the curtain about to fall." Before midnight we were on the road again. The docks at Tilbury stretched out like a labyrinth of shadows and silence. The tide was running high, and the river whispered sullenly against the pilings. Far off, the foghorn of a distant steamer moaned across the estuary. Holmes moved with uncanny assurance, his dark figure ghost-like against the lantern's glow. "There, Watson, the old depot." He pointed toward a squat building of stone, its windows dark, its roof sagging with neglect. Fairborn described it well. As we approached, a flicker of light showed through the cracks in the boards. We crept closer. Peering through a gap, I beheld a strange sight. Within, 3 men stood around a wooden table. One was Bragg, his arm bound from the wound Holmes had given him. Another was a foreign-looking fellow, thin and sharp-featured, who scribbled furiously upon a ledger. The third, standing apart, was unmistakable, the same cloaked figure I had glimpsed on the wharf. The captain. "Tomorrow night," the captain was saying, "we sail at high tide. The papers are ready, the diamonds secure. Once we reach Calais, the cargo will be delivered to the Frenchmen. After that, London may search the river from source to sea, and find only ghosts." Bragg muttered something inaudible. The captain struck the table with sudden violence. "And Fairborn, if he speaks, we hang. He must be silenced before dawn." Holmes drew a sharp breath beside me. "So," he whispered, "our friend's resurrection has not gone unnoticed. We must act tonight. What do you propose?" He smiled faintly. "A little improvisation, and a touch of melodrama." We withdrew to the shadows and made our way round to the rear of the building. Holmes examined the lock, an old rusted affair, and with a swift movement of his knife forced it open. We entered without sound. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of tar and mildew. The men were still arguing, unaware of our presence. Holmes motioned me toward a pile of crates stacked against the wall. From his pocket he drew a small packet and whispered, "A simple chemical, a touch of phosphorus and chlorate. When the time comes, light it." "What will it do?" "Convince our adversaries that the devil himself has come to collect them." He smiled grimly and slipped into the shadows. Moments later I heard his voice, clear, commanding, and utterly transformed. "Gentlemen," he said from the darkness, "your meeting is at an end." The effect was electric. Bragg gave a cry and reached for his pistol. The foreign clerk stumbled backward, knocking over the lantern. And then I struck the match. A blaze of pale blue flame leapt up along the wall, hissing and sputtering like fire from the pit itself. "The devil!" screamed one man. "It's a trap!" Holmes stepped forward into the ghostly light, revolver in hand. "You are quite mistaken. It is only Sherlock Holmes." Pandemonium followed. Bragg fired wildly, the bullet splintering a beam above my head. Holmes returned fire. The weapon clattered from Bragg's grasp. The captain made for the back door. But I was there before him. He swung a knife, and I felt the cold sting across my sleeve before I struck him down with the butt of my revolver. When the smoke cleared, the three men lay disarmed and cursing, and Holmes stood over them, calm as ever. "Well, Watson," he said, "that concludes Act 1 of our little resurrection. The curtain will rise again at Scotland Yard." By dawn, Inspector Lestrade himself had arrived with constables to escort the prisoners. Under Holmes's direction, the depot was searched thoroughly. Among the crates they discovered not only stolen jewels, but diplomatic papers bearing foreign seals, evidence enough to suggest espionage of a most dangerous kind. Holmes regarded the trove with quiet satisfaction. So ends the enterprise of Mr. Venner, smuggler, spy, and resurrectionist. "And the captain?" I asked, glancing toward the bound man. Holmes studied him. "He is no mere river thief. Note the hands. Educated, manicured, the bearing of command. I would wager he is an Englishman of rank, hiding behind a foreign alias." He smiled thinly. "But names, like corpses, have a way of surfacing. We shall have his before the week is out." Fairborn, when informed of the capture, wept with relief. Yet even then, Holmes's gaze remained thoughtful, as if a piece of the puzzle still eluded him. That evening, as we sat again by the fire, I asked what troubled him. He took his violin from its case and drew the bow gently across the strings, producing a single, haunting note. "Watson," he said softly, "we have unearthed the body and the conspirators. Yet the true architect of this charade remains unseen. Venner fled before the storm, but there is another hand, one who signed the death, the smuggling, and the letter alike." "Who then?" Holmes smiled without mirth. "Why, the man who wept so earnestly for his lost partner, and warned us to let sleeping devils lie," I gasped. "Halbridge." "Precisely," said Holmes. "The gentleman who buried another, twice." Chapter 7. The Devil's Partner. London at first light is like no other city in the world. It breathes in a weary hush between the receding darkness and the birth of the day, a city in suspended motion. On that particular morning the hush felt heavier than usual, as though the streets themselves had grown aware of the storm that now approached Baker Street. Holmes had been awake since before dawn. I found him in his chair before the fire, his greatcoat cast aside, the veins of thought visible across his forehead as he examined a stack of papers and a battered copy of the Times. Fairborn sat across the room, silent and sullen, the firelight painting shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. Holmes did not glance up when I entered. "Watson, I have determined the next step, and it will take us into the very heart of this conspiracy. Holbridge." I drew nearer. "But you say he has remained unseen. How do we even begin to reach him?" Holmes smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "By becoming the bait, my dear fellow. Holbridge is a predator who never acts unless he believes the quarry is within reach. Our task is to offer him the scent." He paused, then went on in a lower voice. "We know he was close to Venner. We know he commanded the operation that concealed Fairborn's fate. And we know that Holbridge, like all men of his caliber, does not work for profit alone, but for influence." I frowned. "And you think he will take it? Step into the trap?" Holmes leaned forward, eyes glinting. "He will, but only if the trap is cunningly laid and the prey is unaware. We must offer Halbridge something he cannot refuse, proof that Fairborn still lives and can testify against him. Our first move was to place Fairborn in protective custody, under the watchful eye of Inspector Lestrade, and to let word quietly leak to Holbridge through channels only Holmes could command. Holmes spent that morning writing letters, sending discreet messages to river informants, and conversing in veiled tones with Scotland Yard. His arrangements were so precise that I could not imagine the man at work without marvel. By afternoon we were in Holborn, in a narrow coffee house known to few except rivermen, and those who trafficked in secrets. Holmes leaned across the table, whispering low. "Watson, our next step requires subtlety. I have arranged a meeting with one of Holbridge's known contacts, a man named Lawton, who deals in shipping manifest forgery. If we can lure Halbridge to Lawton, we may then draw him out into the open." As Holmes spoke, A shadow fell across the table. Lofton himself stepped forward, a lean figure dressed in shabby black, his coat too large and his hat pulled low. His sharp eyes flicked over us with suspicion. "You're late, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I was beginning to think your interest had vanished." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, but we must speak in private." Lofton leaned close. "Word travels fast. Halbridge knows you are stirring in his affairs. He will not stand idle. If you value your life, you must act carefully." Holmes's voice was low and deliberate. "That is why I need your help, Mr. Lawton. We have a mutual interest in ensuring certain things never see the light of day. Chiefly the return of Mr. Fairborn." Lawton's lips curled into a faint smirk. "You wish to bargain with Halbridge?" Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely, and for that we require an invitation. One only you can provide." Lawton studied us both a long moment before nodding. "Meet me at midnight in Wapping. There I can ensure the invitation. But I warn you, Holmes, Halbridge is no man to be trifled with. He will expect a test of loyalty." Holmes stood adjusting his coat. "Then we shall ensure he has it." We parted company with Lawton, and I returned to Baker Street with a sense of unease. Holmes, however, remained in the sitting room, immersed in thought. He did not sleep that night, I later learned, but instead prepared in silence for our journey to Wapping. When midnight came, we crossed London in a hansom under an air of conspiratorial quiet. Wapping was a different city at that hour, a district of shadows and whispers, where the river spoke louder than any man. Fog rolled in low from the Thames, curling between warehouses like living things. Lofton awaited us at a crooked doorway, flanked by two broad men in coats of oilskin. He ushered us silently into a cellar dimly lit by lanterns, where the air smelled of salt and tar. A table stood in the middle, upon which lay documents, maps, and a bottle of whiskey. "Halbridge will come," Lawton said, "but not until I am sure you have what he seeks. He has ears everywhere." Holmes leaned forward, examining the papers. "Our message must be unmistakable. Fairborn lives. Halbridge must believe it, and he must believe we are prepared to bargain." Lofton grinned. "And what will you offer him?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "That is the question we answer tonight." A faint scraping sound drew our attention toward the door. Lofton stiffened, and the lantern light flickered. Holmes's hand went to his revolver. The door opened slowly, and there stood Halbridge, tall, gaunt, his face pale beneath the shadow of his hat, his eyes cold as winter. His presence filled the room with a certain gravity, as if a hawk had entered among pigeons. "I hear," he said softly, "that Fairborn still breathes." Holmes inclined his head. "You hear correctly, sir. And you will hear more, if you join us in conversation." Halbridge stepped inside. "You play a dangerous game, Mr. Holmes, and yet I am curious. Speak." Holmes produced the papers and laid them upon the table. "Evidence of your enterprise. Shipping manifests. Correspondence. The proof that Fairborn was more than a man. He was your instrument. We offer him to you alive. For a price." Halbridge's thin lips pressed together. "You tempt me." Holmes smiled faintly. "It is not temptation. It is certainty. You will come to us, if only to hear the price." Halbridge studied us both in silence, then turned toward Lawton. "Arrange it," he said. Lawton inclined his head. "Midnight tomorrow. Wapping. The usual place." Halbridge's gaze returned to Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, you are playing with fire." Holmes's answer was a quiet, deliberate smile. "And yet, Halbridge, it is fire that burns away the lies." With that, Halbridge turned and vanished into the fog. The cellar door shut with a faint click, leaving only the sound of the Thames whispering in the dark. As we walked back toward Baker Street, Holmes said softly, "We have him, Watson. The trap is set, but it is not yet sprung. Tomorrow night we shall see whether Halbridge is the man who buries secrets, or the man who buries the living." The words hung between us as London slept beneath the veil of mist. Chapter 8. The Midnight Bargain. The air in London that night was saturated with fog and portent. By the hour of my leaving Baker Street, the streets were silent save for the distant creak of a hansom and the muffled footfalls of a solitary patrol. Holmes moved with his customary precision, carrying no more than a small case and the pallor of determination upon his face. We arrived at Wapping before the hour agreed with Lawton. The narrow quay was lit by no more than a single swinging lantern, casting a tremulous circle of light upon the cobblestones slick with river mist. Holmes stepped lightly, but with an intent that bespoke both patience and peril. Lawton emerged from the shadows, nodding toward us. "He will be here," he said softly. "Halbridge trusts neither of us completely, yet he cannot resist such an offer." I felt a chill in my spine. "And the price?" I asked. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he checked the lock on a nearby warehouse door and motioned us inside. The space beyond was cavernous, filled with the scent of salt and tar, and the faint sound of water lapping against unseen holes. Inside, the table awaited, covered with maps, manifest sheets, and 2 flasks of whiskey. Lawton gestured toward a corner where a single chair had been placed. "He comes alone. No witnesses." Holmes placed the last of the papers before him. "We must speak plainly when the time comes. The game is no longer one of secrecy, but of survival." The minutes passed with a silence so heavy it seemed to press upon the walls themselves. Then softly the sound of boots, deliberate and slow, echoed through the mist outside. Halbridge entered. He wore a long dark coat, collar turned high, and a hat pulled low. His thin face was drawn, and his pale eyes gleamed in the light of the lantern. "Gentlemen," he said without ceremony, "I take it this is the meeting you arranged." Holmes inclined his head. "It is. You wish to see Fairborn alive. That I can offer you, but there is a cost, one that must be agreed before we proceed." Halbridge moved closer to the table, his eyes flicking over the documents as though weighing their worth. "Speak." Holmes placed a sealed packet before him. "Proof of your operation, Halbridge. Shipping records, letters, names. Enough to bring down the entire enterprise. But I offer you something else. A clean departure from England for your cause, and the silence of Scotland Yard regarding certain matters." Halbridge studied the packet in silence. At length he said, "You bargain as though I am a man of reason. I am a man of necessity. Tell me, why would you offer such terms?" Holmes's voice was low and deliberate. "Because I wish to end this farce without needless bloodshed. Fairborn's life is proof enough of what you are capable of. But I offer you a choice, the bargain of a lifetime." Halbridge leaned forward. "And the terms?" "Fairborn must leave England under your escort. He must take nothing with him save his own life. In return you disappear, leaving the river and your accomplices behind." There was silence. Then Halbridge's thin lips curled. "And if I refuse?" Holmes's eyes met his with unflinching calm. "Then you face the certainty of exposure, and no captain, no matter how cautious, can outrun the tide." Halbridge's gaze flickered to Lawton, who inclined his head in confirmation. Halbridge leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You tempt me, Mr. Holmes, but you must prove Fairborn is alive." Holmes gestured toward a side door. "You will see him now." Fairborn, pale and weary, was brought forth under guard. His appearance was enough to sway even the most hardened of men. Halbridge's face hardened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You keep your word?" he asked Holmes. Holmes inclined his head. "I keep mine, sir." For long moments Halbridge studied Fairborn. At last he said quietly, "Then I will hear your terms in full." Holmes spoke plainly, drawing the terms out as though they were a treaty of war. Halbridge listened with a careful neutrality that suggested he was weighing every syllable against some hidden scale. At length he nodded. "It is agreed," he said. "But I warn you, if I am deceived, Mr. Holmes, there will be retribution." Holmes inclined his head. "So be it." Halbridge turned away, stepping back into the mist of Wapping. "Midnight tomorrow, Holmes. The tide will take us. As he disappeared, Holmes leaned toward me. "Watson, tomorrow night we cross the threshold. We shall either capture Halbridge or lose Fairborn forever. And remember, nothing is as it seems." The streets of London were silent as we departed. Behind us the Thames whispered of conspiracies, of bargains struck in darkness, and of a fate that now hung by the thinnest of threads. Chapter 9. The Rising Tide. That evening, Baker Street was filled with a rare stillness. Holmes sat at the table, poring over his notes by lamplight, his brows knit so tightly I feared they might never relax. The air in our sitting room was thick with tobacco smoke and the scent of stale coffee, the smell of a mind at work. Fairborn sat in a chair near the fire, still pale and trembling, but his eyes now carried a spark of determination. He had eaten little, yet he spoke softly to Holmes with a manner of quiet urgency. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "if this is to end, I must know what fate you have planned for me." Holmes regarded him in silence for a moment before replying. "Your fate, Mr. Fairborn, lies in the hands of another. Our work tonight will decide whether you live in peace abroad, or perish as part of a scheme that has already cost too many lives." I seated myself beside the fire, sensing that the hour of reckoning was near. Holmes turned to me at last. "Watson, the tide comes at midnight. We go to Wapping. Halbridge believes he holds the advantage, but I intend to prove otherwise." By dusk we were moving through London, the fog thickening as the hours passed. Wapping was transformed by the hour into a shadow world, a labyrinth of narrow lanes, warehouses, and hidden wharves. Holmes led the way with quiet certainty, avoiding the lit streets, and keeping to the dark recesses of the dockside. Lofton met us at a side quay, his expression grave. "He knows you are coming. Holbridge has been seen moving along the riverbanks tonight. You may expect resistance." Holmes inclined his head. "Resistance is inevitable, Mr. Lawton. But tonight we turn his own tide against him." We approached the warehouse that had been chosen for the meeting. Holmes paused, listening. The night was so still that the whisper of the tide seemed amplified, and even the creak of a moored vessel rang through the air. From somewhere beyond the darkness came the faint sound of oars striking water. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "They approach by boat," he murmured. "Holbridge trusts his own element." At precisely the agreed hour, midnight, a small launch came slipping through the mist, carrying a solitary figure. Halbridge stepped aboard the quay with deliberate calm, his tall form swathed in a long coat, his face masked beneath the shadow of his hat. Lofton and two men followed close behind. Holmes greeted him without ceremony. "We have brought Fairborn, as promised." Halbridge's eyes swept over Fairborn with a curious mixture of suspicion and relief. "You honor your bargain, Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "but I have my own conditions." Holmes inclined his head. "Let them be heard." The two men stepped aside while Halbridge moved closer to inspect the papers Holmes laid before him. Manifest sheets, letters, and a sealed packet. His pale eyes scanned each document with care, then flicked toward Fairborn. "You are sure he is fit to travel?" Halbridge asked in a low voice. "He is," Holmes replied, "but the question is whether you will keep your word." Halbridge smiled faintly, a smile without warmth. "And if I do not?" Holmes's answer was a single firm word. "Then." Before Halbridge could respond, Lawton stepped forward. "The tide awaits, Captain. Shall we?" Halbridge paused, then gave a curt nod. "Very well, but I warn you, this is no ordinary crossing." Holmes's eyes glimmered. "Indeed, Captain. It is a crossing that may decide everything." We followed Halbridge to the launch. The river lay like molten silver beneath the moon, and the fog seemed to curl around us like living fingers. As we stepped aboard, the smell of salt and oil filled my senses, and I felt the subtle weight of foreboding pressing upon me. Holmes positioned himself with quiet precision at the prow, his revolver at hand. Laughton and Fairborn were seated amidships, guarded by the two men who had followed Halbridge. I remained close to Holmes, my own heart quickening. The launch moved silently into the river. Around us the city was swallowed by fog, and the lights of London became nothing but pale, trembling points in the distance. Halbridge stood at the stern, his gaze fixed on the water. His voice, when he spoke, was low and measured. "Mr. Holmes, you have played a careful game. But the river does not forgive the curious." Holmes replied in kind, without lowering his eyes, "Nor does it forgive those who bury the living." A silence fell between us, broken only by the faint lapping of water and the creak of the vessel's timbers. The current was swift, carrying us into the unknown. Then, without warning, a cry rang out from the bow of the launch. A shot followed, sharp and close. Holmes sprang forward, revolver raised. "Watson, to cover!" The two men guarding Fairborn leapt to their feet, drawing weapons. Halbridge moved with unnatural swiftness toward the cabin, and Lawton's voice rang sharp in the fog. "Mr. Holmes, they are coming for us." From the darkness came the sound of splintering wood and muffled cries. Figures emerged from the fog, black silhouettes moving fast upon the water, their oars striking with deadly intent. Holmes's revolver barked twice, then a third shot rang out. I fired blindly into the gloom. A splash answered my shot, followed by silence. Holmes turned to me, his face grave. "Watson, they have taken the bait. Now the tide rises." The launch pitched sharply as the river current grew swifter, carrying us towards some unseen goal. Halbridge's pale face was set in determination, but I thought I caught a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The last words he spoke before the fog swallowed him were cold and measured. "You may think you have the advantage, Mr. Holmes, but the river keeps its own counsel." Holmes's hand tightened on the rail. "Then we shall force it to speak." The night had turned into something beyond the mere pursuit of justice. It was now a battle, a contest of minds and wills, played out upon the silver stage of the Thames. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me that what awaited us at the rising tide was no ordinary resolution. For Halbridge was no ordinary criminal. He was a man who had mastered the art of secrets, and the river was his ally. Chapter X. The River's Secret. The river was a thing of living shadow that night. Fog curled across its surface like smoke from some unseen furnace, swallowing sound and light. Even the oar strikes of our pursuers had become muffled whispers. Holmes stood at the prow of the launch, his figure a dark silhouette against the pale glimmer of the Thames. Behind him, Fairborn sat huddled, guarded by Lawton and the two broad men who had accompanied us. Halbridge at the stern kept his eyes fixed upon the fog as though he were expecting an apparition to emerge. The hour was close to the witching point, that strange liminal time between midnight and the dawn, and yet no word passed between us. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the creaking of timbers strained by the tide. At last Holmes spoke in a voice low enough for only I to hear. "Watson, the river conceals more than the path to our quarry. It holds the proof of his guilt, and tonight we will find it." I glanced toward him. "Proof, Holmes, after all that we have seen." He nodded once. "The proof that will decide this case lies not in the words of men, but in what the river itself will reveal." We had sailed further into the estuary than I realized. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened until we could barely make out the forms of the oarsmen behind us. The world was reduced to darkness, and the faint glimmer of lantern light reflected in the water. Suddenly a sound came to us, the faint scrape of a hull against wood. Halbridge stiffened, gripping the rail as though for purchase. Holmes moved quietly toward him, revolver in hand. "Captain," Holmes said softly, "you are aware, I think, that the tide has brought us to your chosen ground." Halbridge's voice was flat. "And what of it?" Holmes stepped closer, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the fog. "It is not enough to speak in threats, Captain. Tonight you will be given a choice. Surrender your conspiracy, or the river will speak for you." At that moment the launch lurched. From somewhere ahead I heard a muffled crash, followed by the sound of splintering wood. One of the guards shouted something in warning, but Holmes moved without haste toward the bow. There, partially hidden in the fog, lay a small rowboat, its hull battered and waterlogged. The side bore the emblem of a shipping company known to both Holmes and myself, a company in which Hulbridge held a controlling interest. Holmes examined it closely, producing a small lamp to illuminate the worn mark. "Watson, this is no ordinary vessel. It is part of the route used for smuggling, and within it lies what we have sought, the ledger of Hulbridge's enterprise." Hulbridge stepped forward, his face pale beneath the shadow of his hat. "You cannot prove it." Holmes smiled faintly. "I have proof enough. The river has preserved your secret, Captain." Without another word, Holmes signaled to Lawton. 2 men moved forward to secure the rowboat while Holmes opened the hatch. From within came the scent of brine and mildew, and the faint rustle of paper. Holmes produced a wet bundle, bound with cord. Breaking it open, he revealed a ledger filled with names, dates, and sums, evidence of shipments, payments, and bribes. Holmes held it aloft. "Here lies the confession you sought, Watson, not written in words, but in the commerce of crime. Hulbridge, your tide has run out." Hulbridge's hand went to his coat, drawing something small and metallic. But Holmes was quicker. A sharp crack rang out, the report of a revolver, and the object clattered harmlessly to the deck. Lytton's men moved in swiftly, pinning Hulbridge with firm grips. Holmes's voice rang out clear and cold. "Captain Hulbridge, you are under arrest for conspiracy, forgery, smuggling, and the attempted murder of George Fairborn." Hulbridge's pale lips pressed into a thin line. "You have not heard the last of this, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head. "Perhaps. But the river has spoken, and I, for one, intend to listen." The return to Baker Street was silent save for the lapping of the river and the occasional murmur of the men who had aided us. Fairborn sat quietly, his face pale but serene, as though the shadow of death which had hovered over him was at last lifted. Holmes placed the recovered ledger upon the table, examining it with deliberate care. "Watson, this is the key to the labyrinth. It will lead us not only to the truth of Holbridge's enterprise, but to the heart of the conspiracy that sought to bury a man twice." Fairborn looked up. "And I?" he asked softly. "What of my life?" Holmes studied him with an intensity that seemed almost cruel. "You will have it, so long as you are willing to speak the truth, e'en to face whatever comes." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his violin untouched beside him. "The river has revealed its secret, Watson. But the tide is far from spent." The hour was late, and as I retired that night I could not shake the feeling that we had crossed some threshold. There was still much to uncover. Hulbridge's motives remained cloaked in shadow, and the ledger, though vital, was but one piece of the puzzle. I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that Holmes was preparing for a final confrontation, one that would decide not merely the fate of George Fairborn, but of every man involved in this strange and deadly affair. And I knew, too, that the river's secret was only the beginning. Chapter 18. The Summoning of Shadows. The morning after our crossing, London awoke to a damp chill, the fog lingering low above the Thames as though loath to relinquish its hold. Baker Street itself was quiet, though the air within 221B seemed charged with the residue of the night's confrontation. Holmes sat at our table, the recovered ledger spread before him, his elbows resting upon it and his head bowed deep in thought. Fairborn stood nearby, hands trembling as he poured himself a cup of weak tea. The shadow of the previous night clung to him still, but there was in his eyes something approaching relief, tempered, perhaps, by fear of what was to come. I moved toward Holmes. "What have you found?" I asked softly. Holmes looked up briefly, his eyes glittering with that peculiar fire. The ledger is a map of corruption, Watson. It names not only the men who trafficked in contraband, but those who hid behind respectable names, financiers, shipping magnates, even members of Parliament. Fairborn gasped. But that means, Holmes interrupted. We have struck deeper than smuggling. We have found the roots of a conspiracy that has festered for years, and we have touched something powerful enough to draw the shadows around us. I glanced toward the window. The fog outside seemed thicker still, curling like fingers upon the gaslight. Shadows, Holmes? Holmes gave me a faint smile. Every criminal enterprise has its guardians, Watson, and these guardians are now aware that their secrets lie exposed. We spent the morning in the quiet study of the ledger. Holmes worked methodically, transcribing names and dates into a new codex. The names alone were enough to chill the blood. Prominent merchants, customs officials, and the captain of a foreign vessel whose routes matched those in Halbridge's plan. Holmes made no comment, but I could see his mind working far beyond the ledger's pages. Occasionally he would lean back, tapping the tip of his finger against his temple, muttering fragments. Wapping, midnight, the crossing, a name yet unnamed. At length he looked up, his expression grave. Watson, we cannot act hastily. Halbridge will not be silent, and his friends will move to protect him. We must summon our own allies, quietly, without herald or trumpeter. Fairborn looked uneasy. You mean Scotland Yard? Holmes shook his head. Not yet. We must see to it that when we act we hold the advantage entirely, for the conspirators will not yield without a fight, and that fight will come for us here, at Baker Street, before long. There was a sudden rap upon our door. Mrs. Hudson's voice called softly, asking if anyone was within. Holmes did not answer. I rose to open it and found a slip of paper laid upon the mat. No note, no signature, merely a single line, written in a hand both precise and unfamiliar. The game is deeper than you know. Trust none but your own shadow. Holmes took the paper without a word, folded it carefully, and placed it in his breast pocket. His face grew stern. Watson, we have been summoned. The shadows themselves are calling us into the depths. That afternoon Holmes called upon Lestrade at Scotland Yard. The inspector greeted us with the mixture of relief and suspicion I had come to expect. Holmes spoke quietly, revealing only a fraction of the ledger's contents. We must move with care, Lestrade, Holmes said. This is not a matter of simple arrests. Halbridge's reach is extensive. You will need your best men at your disposal, but only when the signal is given. Lestrade nodded gravely. Understood, Holmes. But you must know these men are dangerous. You cannot rely upon the law alone. Holmes's gaze was fixed. Indeed, and so we must rely upon shadows. That night Holmes and I returned to Baker Street under a mantle of quiet urgency. Fairborn was gone, spirited away for his protection, Holmes explained, and the ledger lay before us like some unspoken verdict. Holmes's hand hovered over it. Tomorrow night, Watson, we summon the conspirators. We draw Halbridge and his allies into the open, and we force the hand of the man who buried another twice. I studied his face, the cold determination within it, and I knew we were moving toward the final act of a case more dangerous than any I had chronicled before. The fog pressed against our windows that night as though listening, and I too felt the summons of shadows drawing closer. Chapter 12. The summons answered. The night was heavy with portent. A fine rain had begun to fall over London, pattering softly against the windows of Baker Street, as though the city itself sought to veil the coming storm. Holmes sat at his desk, his attention fixed on the ledger, though his fingers drummed impatiently upon the table. I found him thus when I entered the room after supper. Holmes, I said, are we prepared for what is to come? Holmes looked up, his dark eyes reflecting both resolve and the faintest shadow of doubt. We are prepared, Watson. But the hour of certainty comes only when the summons is answered. And tonight, we answer it. At that moment there was a knock upon the door, sharp, deliberate. Holmes rose without hesitation. Watson, this is the moment. We opened the door to find Lawton, his expression grave, his overcoat dripping with rain. They are gathered, he said quietly. Halbridge is not alone. They come in numbers. At midnight, at the old warehouse in Wapping. It is the place you named. Holmes nodded. Then we have our summons answered. By 11:30 we had made our way to Wapping once again. The rain had ceased, but a thick fog lingered along the river, and the air was heavy with salt and smoke. Holmes moved with his usual silent precision, accompanied by Lawton, Fairborn, and a small band of trusted men Holmes had gathered in secret. The warehouse loomed ahead like a phantom. Its weathered timbers were lit by the faint glow of lanterns within, casting long shadows across the quay. From somewhere inside came the sound of low voices, deliberating, plotting, conspirators summoning their own courage for what was to come. Holmes paused. "They are assembled," he said softly, "and we must draw them forth." We stepped forward without hesitation. Holmes raised his hand. "Now." Inside the scene was one of tense expectation. Figures moved in the dim light, Halbridge among them, flanked by men whose faces were half hidden beneath coats and hats. At the far end of the hall was a table piled with crates, papers, and ledgers. The air was filled with the smell of tobacco and the faint sting of gunpowder. Holmes stepped into the light, his presence commanding silence. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying over the murmur, "we meet at last. You have hidden much from the eyes of the world. You have trafficked in secrets and buried a man twice, but the hour of concealment is past." Halbridge turned to him, his pale face set in a mask of defiance. "Holmes," he said, "you have no proof." Holmes gestured toward the crates. "Proof lies here, Captain. The ledger you thought was buried beneath the tide. And more. A map of every route, every name, every act that marks your guilt." From behind him, Lawton stepped forward, producing the same sealed packet we had offered Halbridge before. "This is the truth, Captain. You cannot deny it." Halbridge's eyes flickered toward Fairborn. "He speaks truth," he said softly. "But there are greater powers here than your law, Holmes." Holmes did not reply. Instead, he stepped forward with deliberate calm. "The law, Captain, is but the reflection of justice, and justice is what we seek tonight." A murmur ran through the gathered men. One stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "And if we refuse this justice?" Holmes's expression hardened. "Then you answer for it. Scotland Yard is on its way. Your names, your deeds will be revealed, and you will be tried for them." Halbridge's hand went to his coat once more, but before he could act, Holmes drew a revolver. "I would advise against it." For a moment the warehouse was still. Then, a sudden commotion, the sound of boots upon planks, a clash of voices. From the shadows came Lestrade and half a dozen officers of the yard, their lanterns scattering the fog into sharp streaks of light. "By order of the law," Lestrade cried, "all present are under arrest." The conspirators exchanged glances, and then, as though bound by unspoken command, Halbridge and his allies laid down their weapons. Holmes stepped forward, his revolver lowered, and gestured toward the captain. "It is over, Captain," he said quietly. Halbridge looked at him, pale but unyielding. "Perhaps. But the game is never truly over, Holmes." Holmes inclined his head. "Perhaps not. But tonight, the tide has turned." The arrest was swift and precise. Lestrade's men moved like a single organism, binding those who had gathered in the shadows and seizing the crates and ledgers that would stand as evidence. Holmes oversaw it all with the calm authority of a man who knows the shape of victory, even if its cost has yet to be counted. When the last man was taken away, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we have answered the summons. But the case is not yet complete. There are still questions to be asked, and truths to be revealed." The fog outside pressed close to the warehouse windows, as if eager to hear what would follow. and I knew in the marrow of my bones that Holmes's work was far from done, for the tide had risen, and what it carried to shore would decide the fate of every man in this tangled affair. Chapter 3. The Unburied Truth. The morning after the arrests broke with a grey, uncertain light that seemed to hang over London like a question yet unanswered. Baker Street was still heavy with the events of the previous night. Holmes sat at his desk, the ledger before him, the room filled with the low murmur of rain upon the windows. I entered quietly, not wishing to disturb him, but found Fairborn already there, pacing the room with a restless unease. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Dr. Watson," he said softly, "I am grateful beyond words for what you and Mr. Holmes have done, yet I cannot shake the certainty that something remains hidden, something greater than Halbridge himself." Holmes did not look up from his work. "There is always something hidden, Fairborn. Crime is rarely what it appears to be. It is a layering of deception, each hiding the next. And Halbridge was but one piece of a far larger puzzle." I took a seat near the fire. "Then what does the ledger reveal, Holmes?" Holmes's fingers paused upon a page, his eyes narrowing. "The ledger confirms Halbridge's guilt in smuggling and conspiracy, yes, but more. It points toward others, men of influence who operate under the guise of legitimacy, men who would see justice buried to protect their own interests." Fairborn's voice was low but urgent. "Holmes, if this is so, what becomes of me?" Holmes looked up at him. "You have already paid dearly, Mr. Fairborn, yet your truth will be the key to this matter's resolution." Holmes spent the better part of the morning in silence, tracing lines upon the ledger as though they formed a map to some concealed truth. At length he spoke. "This ledger is not merely evidence. It is an invitation to follow the thread Holbridge spun, leading us into the heart of a network more dangerous than any man we have encountered." Fairborn looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "And can we follow it?" Holmes's expression was resolute. "We must, for the sake of justice, and for the sake of those who have been buried twice, in truth and in body." I watched him lean forward, making notes in his own cipher, his mind as sharp and restless as ever. The day passed in a haze of tobacco smoke and muted conversation, until at last Holmes looked up, his face grave but certain. "We move tonight," he said. "We must confront the force that lies behind Holbridge, for this is no longer a matter of a single man's crime. It is a matter of a conspiracy that threatens the very heart of the city." By nightfall, Baker Street was filled with a tense expectancy. Holmes moved quietly, gathering the necessary tools: the ledger, a revolver, a bundle of notes, and his cloak. Fairborn, though pale, seemed determined to accompany us. We crossed London in silence, the gas lamps casting a wavering glow upon the wet pavement. Holmes led us to a narrow street near the heart of the city, a street I had not noticed before, one that seemed forgotten even by the city itself. At its end was a door of heavy oak, marked only by a brass plate bearing a cipher that Holmes recognized at once. He paused before it, his fingers tracing the symbol. "This is the threshold, Watson," he said softly. "Behind this door lies the truth, and the man who buried it." Holmes pushed the door open without ceremony. Inside, a figure awaited us. Not Halbridge, but a man of calm authority, seated in the dim glow of a lamp. His eyes were sharp, his expression composed. He rose as we entered. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice even, "you have followed the tide far enough. It is time you learned what lies beneath." Holmes regarded him steadily. "And you, sir, are the master of the tide?" The man smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But the tide answers to no one. It carries truth and deceit alike, and it is for you to decide which you will follow." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. In that moment I knew we were at the brink of revelation. The truth that Holmes had sought for so long was finally before us. Holmes turned to me. Watson, prepare yourself. The unburied truth awaits. Chapter 14th. The gentleman buried, twice. The room to which Holmes led us was narrow and suffused with the low light of a single lamp. The air smelled of old wood, ink, and the faint tang of the river beyond. Our guide, a man whose bearing suggested both authority and danger, rose from his seat and motioned us toward a table scattered with papers. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice smooth as polished stone, "you have followed the river's secret to its source. It is time you learned the truth of George Fairborn's fate, and of your own involvement in this affair." Holmes did not reply immediately. He stood with that peculiar stillness of his, as though weighing the weight of his next words. At length he said, "We stand at the end of a path of deception. You speak as if you are the arbiter of this matter, but truth does not belong to you alone." The man smiled faintly. "Perhaps not, but truth lies here," he said, gesturing to the table. "In these documents is proof that Fairborn was buried twice, once in the earth and once in the deliberate obscurity of a scheme designed to erase him." Fairborn stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "Explain it. I must know." The man's eyes fixed upon him. George Fairborn was not merely a victim of smuggling. He was the intended witness to a conspiracy that would have brought ruin to powerful men. His burial was intended to silence him permanently. Holmes turned to him sharply. "And you? Who are you in this design? A guardian of justice, or of power?" The man inclined his head. "Call me what you will, Mr. Holmes. I am merely the last keeper of a tide that has run for years." Holmes crossed the room to stand before him, his voice now steady but filled with quiet force. "The tide runs deep indeed, but I have followed its current to this chamber. I know its course, and I know its source." He turned to me, his gaze steady. "Watson, the ledger, the crossings, the summons, all have led to this moment. Holbridge was but a courier of truth and deception alike. The man before us holds the deeper secret." The man inclined his head once more. "Yes. And it is a secret that must be faced." Holmes gestured toward Fairborn. "George, speak. Tell us what they sought to hide." Fairborn's voice was steady now, though edged with pain. "They wished to erase me, to remove all evidence of the corruption that flowed in their wake. My name, my testimony, my life. They buried me once to conceal my death, and again to conceal my truth." A silence fell upon the room, broken only by the faint murmur of the river outside. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting the quiet. "And now, gentlemen, the tide has turned. The truth is unburied. The ledger is in safe hands. Holbridge and his allies stand revealed, and the man who buried the gentleman twice stands before justice." The man at the table inclined his head. "So it ends." Holmes shook his head. "No, it ends only when justice is served, and for that the tide must carry these truths to shore." Lestrade's voice echoed from the doorway, accompanied by the sound of boots and the arrival of more constables. "Mr. Holmes, we are ready to take them into custody." Holmes turned to me with a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Watson, we have lived long enough to know that justice is never simple, but tonight it has been done." Fairborn stepped forward, placing his hand on Holmes's arm. "I owe you my life, Mr. Holmes, and my gratitude." Holmes inclined his head. "You owe no more than the truth, Mr. Fairborn. Guard it well." As they led the conspirators away, Holmes turned to me with that familiar air of finality. "Watson, there are cases that end in resolution, and there are cases that end in revelation. This is both. The gentleman buried twice is now at last unburied." Outside, the fog over London began to lift. The tide had receded, and with it the shadows that had clung to this case seemed to dissipate, leaving the city for a brief moment in the light of truth.